Over to Hector.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. A really interesting discussion. And thanks again to Claire. I mean, people have spoken very eloquently about the crisis in services, the continuation of austerity, and how this is affecting people's lives, including mental distress. After 14 years of Tory rule, people voted for a Labour government to put an end to all of this. And what they're getting is more of the same. This is the essence of the securonomics that Rachel Reeves is promoting, which, yes, involves a break with some aspects of neoliberalism, but not the kind of aspects that we would like to see, not the kind of break we would like to see. She is trying to combine more state intervention with a ramping up of more austerity, more cuts, more attacks on public services, more privatization. And when at the end of next month, Rachel Reeves announces a fresh round of austerity, and at the same time we hear from Keir Starmer that he's going to increase the defence budget, we have to say that this is not, the workings of the market, the invisible hand of capitalism. These are political choices that the Starmer, Reeves, and so on are making. A socialist worker says this week, Starmer wants us to pay for more war. We have to be out making the connection. And when they tell us here that disabled people and people on benefits are going to pay for a ramping up of military spending, the left has to be out saying that we're not going to have more of that and we're going to organize mass resistance to it. This is what the Summit of Resistance is about. It's about saying enough is enough. Remember that. It's about saying we're going to fight back against this rotten government that continues to attack ordinary people. It's about saying that we're not going to have it anymore when the leaders of trade unions and of the TUC say that we have to give Starmer a chance. Or when they say that he's doing his absolute best, but he has to deal with the legacy of 14 years of Tory austerity. And it's about saying we're not going to allow the likes of Nigel Farage to pose as an anti-establishment figure when the left, we are the people who are fighting for better housing, who are fighting for better conditions, who are fighting for better jobs, for better wages, and for all of that. So that's what the Summit of Resistance is about. It's about supporting people like Claire. It's about encouraging more people to take action themselves, about going on a strike, about building resistance, and everybody has to build that event and be there for the reasons that everybody has said tonight. That's the first thing I wanted to say. Second point, is Ukraine a defeat for imperialism, for US imperialism? I think there are indications that, that could be the case. I think it remains an open-ended question, though. The negotiations are only beginning to unfold. From the perspective of US imperialism, really what Trump is doing is to try to pull out of a conflict where he thinks US imperialism doesn't have a lot to gain from. What he thinks is that the US has been subsidizing a protracted conflict, and his argument is that the US, shouldn't be involved in this question. He's trying to push, the West, the European powers to deal with the question of the threat of Russian imperialism. That's not to say, I'll tell you who it is a defeat for, as Martin said, the European leaders, who for the last 3 years have told us that, the war in Ukraine was about defending liberal values, that it was about democratic values versus authoritarianism, and who are now receiving a rude awakening. By the way, so is Zelensky, who today was blamed by Trump for being responsible for the war in Ukraine. So, what you see here, from the point of view of Trump, this makes perfect sense. He thinks that a decade on from Barack Obama's pivot to Asia, instead of focusing on China, what has happened to US imperialism is that it has been dragged to a new war in Eastern Europe, it's been dragged to a set of wars in the Middle East, and what he's trying to do is again to concentrate resources on the question of containing China. The project of going it alone is about saying the US is not going to be responsible for all these institutions of international liberal capitalism, The US is going to be much more focused on enhancing and promoting the interest of US capitalism alone, at the expense of the people who have been the US's natural allies for the last 80 years. I mean, this is what a lot of the statements, the provocative statements that Trump has been making since the inauguration are really about. When Trump started talking about things like wanting to buy Greenland, or about taking over the Panama Canal, or about renaming the Gulf of Mexico as the Gulf of America, which he has done, or about inviting Canada to become the 51st state of the United States. People who thought this was just like, your classic Trump antics, are realizing that this is more than that. There's a serious underlying project here, which is really about talking up an aggressive policy of expansion, of imperialist expansion. The question of Greenland is about the way in which the leading imperialist powers are positioning themselves to dominate the Arctic, which as a result of climate change, is now completely melted for part of the year. It's becoming a new route for shipping and for competition in that way. This is an incredibly dangerous situation. We need to be out on the streets opposing Keir Starmer, who wants to tie Britain to this project. Keir Starmer is desperate to maintain the special relationship that has united Britain as a junior partner to US imperialism in the recent period. He's promoting himself as a bridge between the European Union and Trump, and we have to be out opposing this. The third and final point I want to make is that, true, we are closest today to fascism than we have been any time before, ever since the interwar years in the 1930s. But it's important to recognize that the 1930s were not simply a decade of, the world drifting inevitably towards fascism. It was a lot more than that. First of all, there was nothing inevitable about the rise of Hitler and of Mussolini. This was a time of mass workers' organizations, of communist parties that were, genuine revolutionary organizations, not of a few thousands of people like we are in the SWP, but of tens of thousands of members, sometimes hundreds of thousands of members, and influencing millions of workers. The possibility of mass resistance to fascism existed, and it was squandered because of the politics of the leadership of those movements, because of the politics of the Stalinist leaders that subordinated the needs of working class people to the needs of the dictatorial regime that Stalinist Russia had become by that point, and by the politics of reformist leaders who didn't want to overthrow capitalism, but instead wanted to tinker around the edges to make it into a nicer system. The possibility, what we have to take away from that is that the rise of the far right today, in Britain and everywhere else, can be stopped if we build mass working class resistance on that model. So all power to everybody that will be involved in protesting the racists on Saturday, and everybody should get involved in building a stand up to racism around that. But the other thing we can take away from the decade of the 30s is that it was a decade of mass social polarization. It wasn't just about the rise of fascism, it was also about the rise of the radical left. It was also the decade of mass strikes and a unionization drive in the United States. It was the decade of mass resistance in France in the form of support of the Popular Front government, and then mass strikes and so on. It was the decade of the Spanish Revolution, in which workers and peasants took power and took control of sections of society. Working class people showed that there was an alternative to capitalism. They showed that it was possible to mount a challenge to capitalism. The new period that is opening up now can also be a period of reaction, of counter-revolution. It can be a period of the rise of fascism, but there is an alternative to that as well today. It can be a period of mass resistance, it can be a period of a struggle, and it can be a period in which working class people again show that we can be the basis for an alternative to society. We need, however, a better leadership than what the workers' movement had in the decade of the 30s and led to the defeat of the anti-fascist resistance, and it led to the horrors of the rise of fascism, the Second World War, and the Holocaust. That is the kind of leadership that we're trying to build in the Socialist Workers' Party. Not because we're amazing, not because we have all the answers, but because it's a kind of leadership where we think that people like Claire is a leader in the class. And we want to build a party of more people like Claire, leading strikes, leading resistance, and taking all these arguments into their communities, into their workplaces, into their universities, and into wherever they are based. So I really want to urge everybody, in the way that the speakers have done today, to think seriously about becoming, if you're worried about the state of the world, if you're terrified by what is coming, don't despair. Don't be paralyzed in the face of it. Instead, become organized, become a revolutionary socialist, and join the Socialist Workers' Party to help us fight for that kind of leadership within the working class.